Good morning. I hope you're enjoying this weather that we're having outside right now. As you already know, classes were canceled for today, and I don't want us to get too far behind. So, as a result, I'm taping this. This is my office at home, and then hopefully we'll be able to keep up with things. If you have any questions following this taping and the lecture that I'm going to be doing today, then we can certainly cover that when we get back together again on Monday, or you could always email me. Don't forget that tonight by 11:59 you have to have your learning to read and use psychological research completed and turned in. So what we're going to start out with, now we've already gone over the neuron and we've looked at how neural impulses take place. Now we're going to get into the nervous system, and we're going to also look at the structures of the brain. So if you want to turn to slide 16 on the PowerPoint that says the nervous system, what you'll see here is a chart basically of the two types of the nervous system. So on the one hand, what you have is the central nervous system. Central nervous system is simply comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. Everything else, all the other nerves that are in the body, are referred to as the peripheral nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, that's further broken down into the somatic, which has to do with the body and the muscles, that sort of thing, and the autonomic nervous systems. Autonomic, when you think autonomic, think automatic. And so that's regulating your heartbeat, that's regulating your breathing, release of hormones, those kinds of things. The autonomic nervous system is further broken down into two separate types, and that is the sympathetic nervous system, which is going to be responsible for expending energy, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for restoring energy. So let's move on to the next slide and get into this in a little bit more detail. First of all, the spinal cord is the information highway. Everything that is going from your body. Remember SAME that I had talked about on Monday. Service, oh my goodness. Sensory afferent, motor efferent. So information is coming in from our senses. You touch something, you touch the table, you touch your cheek, you touch something like that, and it's going to activate sensory receptors in your fingertips. That message is then going to follow along the nervous system all the way up into your brain. There it's going to be interpreted. Your brain is going to look at, what do I already know? And it's going to look at, is this a new sensation? What does it feel like? Does it feel smooth? Does it feel rough? Does it feel hot? Does it feel cold? We have all different kinds of sensory receptors in our fingertips, for example. And then it's going to interpret that and then tell us what we're going to do. So let's say that it brings pleasure to us by stroking the face or something like that. So we're going to continue to do that. Those messages from the brain out to the muscles then are going to travel along the motor or efferent neurons. So the spinal cord is that two-way highway. Information is constantly going back and forth. Now, sometimes we have to react much more quickly than it would take for the message to get from the sensory receptor up to our brain and then act on it. And this is known as a spinal reflex. So for example, let's say you're walking along on the beach, and we'll pretend just for a bit that it's a beautiful day outside. The sun is shining, you're just enjoying yourself, and you've decided to take your shoes and socks off, and you're walking in your bare feet, and lo and behold, you step on something sharp. What will happen? Before your brain can even register, ouch, there's pain there, you will already be lifting your foot away from the sharp object. What happens is there's kind of like a bridge, a shortcut method that's in your spinal cord that will cut the gap from the incoming sensory information to the muscle reflex. Okay, and so you start to lift your foot away from that painful stimulus. That bridge there is known as an interneuron, and interneurons are located in your spinal cord. Now, what will also happen is the message will finally get up to your brain, and it'll say, ouch. The pain fibers will register, and you'll know that you need to continue to look at your foot and see if there's any damage or anything along those lines, and you'll inspect it. Okay, so the interneuron is the bridge, but those are located directly in your spinal cord. Moving on to the rest of the peripheral nervous system now. On the next slide, on slide 18, as I had mentioned, the peripheral nervous system is broken down into the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. So the somatic are the nerves that are going from the sensory receptors to the brain and then going out to the skeletal muscles. So that includes both the sensory and the motor, or the afferent and the efferent neurons. The autonomic nervous system, however, is going to control our bodily functions. It is going to control our organs. It's going to control our glands. Okay, so when you think of autonomic, as I mentioned before, think automatic. You're not thinking, oh, wait, now my pituitary gland needs to secrete some hormones because, I'm frightened. No, what's going to happen is you see something that frightens you, and if you'll remember in the video, when the guy goes, ah, like that sort of thing, except it's much worse than what I can possibly do, that it causes an increase in heart rate. It kicks into gear our fight, flight, or freeze. And so as a result, then, all of these things are happening automatically. Our breathing goes up. We begin to perspire because our body temperature is going. We're not thinking about any of those things. And that's because that's happening in our autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system is broken down further into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is going to expend a great deal of energy, especially during emotional arousal. So when we're angry, when we're upset, when we're frightened, what's going to happen is there's going to be a lot of energy that is going to be expended biologically. But what will happen also is after a while you're going to run out of that energy and your body's going to need to replenish the stores that have been lost. So what will happen then is the parasympathetic nervous system will be kicked into gear in order to restore energy. So let's say, for example, let's say you're being confronted by a bear. I'm talking about like a grizzly bear, 6-foot grizzly bear. You're out in the woods, you're enjoying the day, and all of a sudden this bear goes, "Arr!" Okay. What will happen is your autonomic nervous system is going to kick into high gear. Your muscles will have a great deal of blood flow. You're ready to either fight that bear or you're ready to run as fast as you possibly can, or maybe stand there stiff and hope that the bear is going to stiff you and not use you for his next meal. So as a result, you're expending a great deal of energy. That is the sympathetic nervous system is kicked into high gear. But after a while, after you've been standing there for 2.5 hours, you're going to get exhausted. You're going to feel like you need to go to sleep. Your body is going to, any food that was undigested before, while you're very upset, now the food will begin to digest. Now the stores will begin to be restored. And what's responsible for that is the parasympathetic nervous system. So let's now look at the structures and functions of the different parts of the brain. If you move on to slide 20, one of the things you'll see there is a rather odd picture. It's the case study of Phineas Gage, and 21 is the same. This shows you what happened to this poor guy. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker. And by the way, if you want, after you download this PowerPoint, bring it up into the full screen, okay, and you can actually click on the link, and the guy that was talking about the neurons and everything like that, he also has a story about Phineas Gage in here as well. So what happens is Phineas Gage was a railroad worker, very kind of laid back, calm, which is a good thing because he worked with explosives. And you want somebody working with explosives that's really kind of relaxed. And so one day, as he was working, now his job was, after someone came along and put the blasting powder into the rock, they would drill a hole down into the rock, they would put blasting powder down in there, then there was supposed to be some kind of a paper wadding that was put down in, and then that would be tamped, and they would use a metal rod. It's probably about, I'm going to say it's about 3 feet long, and they'll tamp that down in so that it gets nice and compact. Then they'll put a, I can't think of what the name of it is right now, but it's going to, a fuse, okay, that'll go down in there. It will ignite the gunpowder, and it blows the rock apart. So as they're clearing the way for the railroad and blowing these rocks apart, that's the way that they would do it. And so Phineas Gage was responsible. He was a foreman, and he was responsible for making sure that it was tamped down in properly and setting everything up. Now, what happened was, for some reason, that wadding was not put in there. Somebody missed it. I don't know if Phineas Gage was supposed to look in and he missed it, or the person who was, putting the powder in missed doing it, or whatever the case is. But what happens when you take a metal rod, a steel rod, and you scrape it on rock? Sparks. And so what happened to Phineas Gage was, he tamps this down. As soon as those sparks hit the gunpowder, it ignites, and instead of blowing the rock apart, since there was no wadding in there to keep the explosion down, the rod goes shooting out of the hole, and you see the path of where the rod went in the picture on 21. The rod went basically up through his cheek and exited the top of his head and flew, I don't know, another 80 feet or whatever the case is. So you'd think, okay, and this was right behind his left eye. You would think, okay, this guy's done for. But the reality is he was able to get up. He was able to talk to people. He did cough up some more brain matter, okay, and after he healed, they thought he was going to die. After he healed, then he was able to continue on, but there was a problem. And the problem was there was a tremendous change in his personality. Now he was very angry, acting out melancholy. In other words, he was very sad many times. His mood would often change. And so they recognized in this case study that a part of our emotions that we control, what's responsible for it is right up here in the prefrontal cortex. All right, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So Phineas Gage recovered completely. They didn't want him playing with dynamite anymore, because let's face it, he, well, realistically, he was not too stable. And then people lost track of him. So if you watch the video, actually, there's a little bit more to the story. So watch the video and see what they have to say. But that's the story of Phineas Gage. And what it points out to us, and you just saw walking behind me our Great Dane, what it points out to us, not only impulse control and controlling our emotions responsible up here, but also that even though we lose some of our brain, we can still continue to function. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that idea of plasticity in just a bit. So how do we find out what's going on up here? How do we find out, how this is working up here? Because you can't now, even though I did describe surgery, that's not the way to really find out what's going on. That's the way to correct something. And so there are a number of different tests. And if you move on to slide 22, this is my morning coffee. You'll see here 5 tests that I've listed. Now, the way that I have them listed, first of all, are in order. The top one is the one that gives you the least amount of information to the bottom one, which gives you the most amount of information. The second thing is from the least expensive to the most expensive. So if you've ever had a sleep study done, most likely what happened is they have attached all of these different kind of like electrodes to your head, and what they're doing is they're measuring brainwave activity. Remember something, folks. When a neurotransmitter lands on a receptor site, the only job of the neurotransmitter is to open an ion channel. That's the only job. After it has opened the ion channel, all of the rest of the processes are electrical. Okay? Remember, the resting state of the neuron is negative 70 millivolts. When those positively charged ions go in, they start to change the membrane till it finally gets up to plus 30 millivolts, which is the action potential. The charge gathers at the axon hillock, which remember is right here at the base of the neuron, and then will fire down the axon that's covered by the myelin sheath. Okay? So just kind of keep those things in mind, because since it's based off of electricity, then we can measure that electricity and see when neurons are firing. And those things are referred to then as brain waves, and they're measured by the electroencephalograph, also known as the EEG. Now, many of you have probably had a CAT scan, computerized axial tomography. This takes X-rays and generates a three-dimensional picture of the brain. Basically, this is going to show any kind of abnormalities. And it's not as finely tuned as the MRI, which I'm going to talk about next. So it will show basic structures and that sort of thing, but not quite as well as the MRI. So the MRI uses radio waves and a magnetic field. If you've ever had an MRI, what happens is it's like this huge electromagnet. And when they fire up the electromagnet, it causes the different organs in our bodies to emit radio waves. Okay, almost like a vibration kind of thing. And the MRI machine or the computers read those radio waves, and then it comes up with beautiful pictures on the screen that are much more finely tuned, so that you can really see the anatomical structures and try to figure out what's going on. The MRI is going to show much more as far as soft tissue is concerned as opposed to the CAT scan. And so they'll often use an MRI as opposed to a CAT scan to check out your brain and see if there's like a tumor there, lesions, whatever the case is. The next test is called the PET scan, or positron emissions tomography. The PET scan basically uses a process where there's a dye that is injected. It's a radioactive isotope that is injected into the bloodstream. Now, this operates on the concept that all of our cells need energy in order to work. And when our neurons are firing, because they're firing so rapidly, they need more energy. So what the radioactive isotope does is it attaches to glucose. Remember, glucose is the fuel source for our cells. And so the more a neuron fires, the more glucose it uses. The more glucose it uses, when you actually look at the the PET scan, it's going to actually show like a brighter color, kind of like an orange or a yellow or a red, and that gives you a good indication of how rapidly the neuron is firing. The neurons that are not firing very much are going to be more of a shade of blue or purple or something along those lines. And so what happens is different tasks will be given to the person who's in the PET scanner, and then the researchers can determine, are these areas working the way that they're supposed to be working? Okay, so that's the PET scan. The last one is called the functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. This uses a similar concept, except instead of measuring glucose, it measures oxygen absorption, because not only do our cells need fuel, but they also need oxygen. And there's no radioactive isotope that attaches to the oxygen, so therefore it's considered a non-invasive procedure. In other words, you don't have to shoot anything into the person's arm in order to be able to do this test, but it is also the most expensive one. So if we move on, slide 23 just shows you what an EEG kind of looks like as far as the netting that goes over and the different electrodes. Now, the one on the left, the model on the left, is more of what's called an ERP. And that is actually, it's a finely tuned electroencephalograph where they can actually determine in much finer detail which neurons are firing and which ones are not. The next slide, number 24, shows you a CAT scan of a human brain. And this is actually a brain with Alzheimer's. You can see the beginnings of some of the decay of the neurons. And then in the lower right-hand corner is what the CAT scanner actually looks like. This is an MRI image, and you can see here that there's a great deal more detail in the MRI image on slide number 25. And if you look in the center part there, sort of a bluish color or whatever, sort of a blob, that's known as the corpus callosum, which is actually a bundle of nerve fibers that connect the left and right hemispheres of the brain. So I'll be talking about that a little bit more in just a few minutes. The last is the PET scanner, and here you can see all those brightly colored lit up areas. With the PET scanner, you can tell how the brain is actually functioning at this point. And so the way the top part of the scan is actually the front, like the frontal lobes, and then the back part is what's known as the occipital lobes, and those are the areas then that I'm having a brain freeze here as far as vision is concerned. Okay? All right, so let's move on to slide number 27. And what I have here is, this is the cerebral cortex. Now, folks, I have it basically just so that you can see that there's a great deal of redundancy, in other words, sameness, built into our brains. Our brains are divided into two hemispheres. Now, this is on the outer area. The outer area is responsible for a lot of our higher order thinking. It's known as the cerebral cortex. Okay, and we'll be looking at this area. We'll also be looking at the hindbrain, which is responsible for more basic functioning and that sort of thing, and also the midbrain. So we'll look at those things in just a little bit. But the cerebral cortex is divided into the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And for the most part, what happens on the right side of the body is actually processed on the left hemisphere of the brain. And what happens on the left side of the body is processed on the right hemisphere of the brain. It's known as contralateral. All right, so don't worry about the term contralateral. If you've had A&P or something like that, then probably you'll get into that, but otherwise don't worry about it. And I said for the most part. It's not 100%. So if you've ever been around someone who's had a stroke, if the blood clot for the stroke is on the left hemisphere of the brain, it means that the right side is going to be paralyzed, and vice versa. Okay, so just kind of keep those things in mind. On the next slide, this is what your brain basically looks like from a side view. And it points out just a couple of things. So the cerebral cortex, if you look at that area there that's all folded in on itself and everything, that's, like I said, the higher order thinking area, also known as the cerebral cortex. I want to show you something, and hopefully this will not be lost in the translation here, in other words, doing it over video. But if you were to take the human brain and flatten it out, in other words, take those tissues on the cerebral cortex and lay them out, it would cover probably a desktop. But we have a skull. And because we have a skull, we've got to fit all of that into that skull. So what happens is, instead of it being just flat, it folds in on itself. And if you look at slide 28, you'll notice all of those ridges. See, you can fit more brain matter into a smaller area if you have all these folds. So hopefully that makes sense to you. Okay. Moving on then to the hemispheres of the cerebral cortex, which is slide 29. Once again, this is not, if you look at the left hemisphere, logic, problem solving, language, and mathematical computations, when you do those things, it not only registers just on the left hemisphere, but your right hemisphere, it's not like your right hemisphere is going to sleep now and only your left hemisphere is operating because you're doing problems of logic or mathematical problems. They're both involved, but it seems like the greater activity is going to be on the left hemisphere of the brain. If you look at the right hemisphere then, visual spatial relations, creativity, discrimination of colors, facial recognition, aesthetic, which means beauty, and emotional responses, understanding metaphors, and creative mathematics. So those are processed more on the right hemisphere, but once again, there's information that is flowing back and forth between the two hemispheres constantly. Just by me going like this, information is flowing back and forth so that my hands can go back and forth. Okay, so that you know, you can get that. So just have a basic idea of what happens in the hemispheres of the brain. But once again, it's not 100%. Now, folks, I'm going to say this. I said it at the beginning of this section. I'm going to say it again now. You have a marvelous brain. It is absolutely amazing. And so when you think of all of the processes that are going on right now, isn't it almost miraculous? It is absolutely amazing. So then we'll look at the four lobes. Now, folks, you need to remember these four lobes. And there are four lobes on each hemisphere of the brain. So in the back here, processing primarily visual information, it's called the occipital lobe. If we start to move from the back and move up, we're going to have the temporal lobe is next. Now, temporal lobe, look at it. Temporal lobe processes auditory information. Folks, where are your temples? Right here, okay? What are your temples close to? Your ears. So think of it. Temporal lobe, temples, close to your ears, processing auditory information. Try to remember it that way. The third then is the parietal lobe, and the parietal lobe is kind of right up in here. Parietal lobe is going to be responsible for processing all of your sensations except for smell. Also going on in the parietal lobe is being able to reach for things. Your motor cortex is right up in that area, you know, that sort of thing. And then finally, in the front here, and this is an easy one to remember, frontal lobes. They're in the front. But look at what the frontal lobes are responsible for. And human beings have the largest frontal lobes of any creature. Responsible for planning, problem solving, reasoning, and expressive language. Okay, if I want to get from point A to point B, I'm going to be using my frontal lobes. Another thing that it's responsible for is impulse control. I feel like jumping up and down right now, but I choose not to because my frontal lobes are keeping things in check. When you want to say something really nasty to somebody, but you say, oh, I'm not going to say that. Your frontal lobes, your executive center is holding back those impulses that you might have that you want to say those kinds of things. So keep in mind, folks, the four lobes and basically what they do. The occipital lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and frontal lobes. So if we move on to slide 31, this is, you can see right here how things are divided. And see how large the frontal lobes are. Now we have these lobes on either side of our brain. So there's a frontal lobe here and there's a frontal lobe here. Parietal lobes, both sides. Temporal lobes, both sides. Occipital lobes, both sides. Okay. The corpus callosum on slide number 32. The corpus callosum is a bundle of some 200 million nerves that lets the left-hand side know what the right-hand side is doing. So it allows us to coordinate information back and forth between the two lobes. Now, sometimes what happens, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this in your class or not, sometimes there is a seizure that starts on one hemisphere of the brain, and the information is actually taken over to the other hemisphere of the brain via the corpus callosum, and as a result there's a full-blown seizure. So one type of psychosurgery is to actually sever, in other words cut, that corpus callosum. Okay? And so just like I said, that's what'll happen is then literally you won't be able to clap your hands, or they may both move in the same direction because that information is not being, connected between the two hemispheres of the brain. All right, so that's the cerebral cortex. Next, we're going to move into the hindbrain. Now, the hindbrain is more in the center and also connects to the brainstem. It's considered the oldest part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that develops first in utero, and this is the one that we have most in common with all other mammals. And the reason I say this is because this is what regulates our heart rate, our temperature, our fluids, everything automatically that's going on in our bodies is being registered through the hindbrain. So it consists of three parts: the medulla, or if you've, I just watched the end of Waterboy last night, and of course in Waterboy, the Colonel Sanders character or whatever talks about the medulla oblongata. Okay, and realistically that's what it is, the medulla or medulla oblongata. The pons and the cerebellum. As I mentioned, these regulate the vital functions in our brain. So let's look at, first of all, in the hindbrain, the pons. The pons is basically the bridge. It is it connects the autonomic nervous system, or I should say the autonomic part of the brain, the automatic part of the brain, with the rest of our brain. So that when we see something that's frightening, that sends a message through the pons to our medulla, which increases our blood pressure and our heart rate and our respiration and those sorts of things. The third part of the hindbrain then is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is known as the little brain. And if you look, let's see, yes, on the next slide, which is slide 35, the sort of a gray mass that's behind the medulla oblongata, and it is thought that the hindbrain is responsible for, and it's called the little brain. You can see here on slide 34, that's what it's called. It's responsible for coordination of not only our body, but probably our thoughts as well as balance. Information, especially when we're learning to do something physically, information is actually stored in the cerebellum to be able to do those physical things, as opposed to remembering that we did them. So, for example, when you learn to ride a bicycle, the very first time you rode a bicycle, you might remember the event. That's stored in the cerebral cortex. But your actual ability to pedal and to balance and to steer and to hit the brakes, that's back here in the cerebellum. Okay, so just try to keep the difference between those two. The midbrain, and I really didn't talk about the midbrain. That's on slide 35. In the midbrain, this is responsible for autonomic or automatic systems with the eyes and with the ears. In other words, the reflexive actions. So when your pupils dilate because there's not enough light, there's not enough light, or constrict because there's too much light. What's registering is actually, that's registering in the midbrain. The same way when we hear things, okay? So that's going through the midbrain as well. So just kind of keep those in mind. Now the limbic system, and I think the guy that I showed the video actually talked about the limbic system. The limbic system is really responsible, and it's a hormonal system that's responsible for things like aggressive behaviors, our memories, our emotions, our drives like hunger, sex, and aggression. And remember when I said before that the parietal lobe was responsible for processing all sensations except for smell? The limbic system is responsible for processing smell. And the reason for this is, it's thought anyways, the theory behind it is that we need smell in order to be safe. Think about this. There's something that's sitting in your refrigerator that's been there for a rather long time, and let's say it's a carton of milk. What's the first thing you do when you take that carton of milk out? Besides checking, let's pretend for a moment that there is no sell-by date on it. What do? You open it up. Oh, and you sniff it. You see, I'm not gonna drink that stuff. Oh my gosh, it smells horrible. We have this emotional response. Or how about this? My sister-in-law is a realtor. And one of the things that she suggests to people who are trying to sell their homes is bake something prior to the house being shown. Because what happens when we bake something and it smells so good and inviting, it gives us a sense of warmth, a sense of family, and very pleasant, and it brings out pleasant emotions. All right, so our sense of smell is very, very much tied into our emotional state. And it's thought, once again, if you're looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, that this is there to help keep us safe. So we'll look at some of the more specific parts of the limbic system. But on slide 37, you can see the limbic system really isn't that big, yet it is very, very powerful. So I don't talk much. Slide 30, I'm not used to just talking and talking. I'm used to interacting with you guys. And so sometimes I get a little bit tongue-tied. So I'm going to take a sip of coffee here. The thalamus, which is a part of the limbic system, is located near the center of the brain. I'm not as concerned that you remember where the thalamus is. I'm more concerned that you remember that it's the relay for sensory stimulation. So information that's coming into the brain is relayed through the thalamus and will then go out to different parts of the brain to be compared with what we already know. Is it a new sensation? Those kinds of things, and how we're going to act on that sensation. Thalamus is also responsible for controlling sleep and attention, coordinating with other parts of the brain. And we're going to talk in just a bit about what's called the reticular activating system, okay, the RAS, and how that really kind of works in concert with the thalamus and other parts of the brain. So we'll cover that in just a few minutes. So there's a picture of your thalamus right there in the center, that blue blob right there. Now the hypothalamus, it's beneath the thalamus, it's located right there, and also very close to what's called the pituitary gland. Now, I want you to keep in mind, folks, jot down in your notes, pituitary gland is known as the master gland. It is responsible for making sure that all of the other glands work the way that they're supposed to. So the hypothalamus is responsible for regulating our body temperature, the concentration of fluids in our body, the storage of nutrients, okay, as well as motivation and emotion. So one of the areas very much involved in our emotional life is the hypothalamus. But look at some of the other things that it's responsible for. Hunger, thirst, sexual behavior, caring for offspring, and aggression. Oh my goodness. So this, if you move on to the next slide, the hypothalamus, that little kind of a burgundy or purplish red dot in our brain, is responsible for all that stuff. So when you see something in your environment that gets you upset, that makes you feel anxious, that frightens you, the hypothalamus is activated. It sends a message to your pituitary gland. Your pituitary gland sends a message to your adrenal glands and gets you all pumped up. So we'll talk about that, not in this section, but we'll talk about that later in the course. So now we're on to slide 42, the hippocampus. Hippocampus is extremely important, not only because of emotional reactivity, but also storing memory. If there is damage to the hippocampus, you can't formulate new memories. You won't remember 30 seconds from now what just happened. Okay? And so, yeah, there's a movie called 50 First Dates that you may have seen at some point, and the character Drew Barrymore in there falls asleep, and the next day when she wakes up, she can't remember anything that happened since the accident that she was in. There is really no such type of amnesia. However, later on in the movie, when she goes to the clinic, she meets a guy by the name of 10-Second Tom, where he goes, "Hi, I'm Tom. Hi, I'm Tom," and introduces himself all the way down the line of people, and by the time he gets to the end, he doesn't remember that he met the very first person. That, believe it or not, is much more accurate. Although it lasts a little bit longer than 10 seconds, maybe 20 to 30 seconds, and then the person doesn't remember what just happened. So the damage to the hippocampus can result in the inability to form new memories. And I want you to think about one of the first areas that's damaged in Alzheimer's disease is the hippocampal area. That's where the deterioration of neurons begins first. So doesn't that start to make a little bit of sense? Hippocampus, on the next slide in 43, you can see is sort of like a horseshoe shaped. Believe it or not, the term hippocampus is actually Latin for horse, or seahorse, I should say. And I'm not sure exactly how that looks like a seahorse, but anyways, we'll move on from there. The next slide, neuroplasticity, slide 44. If you have damage in your brain, believe it or not, what will start to happen is the neurons, the axons and dendrites of neighboring neurons that are actually undamaged will start to work around the damaged area and will actually start to form a new neural network. Now, if the person is young, if it's a young child, and this happens, the opportunity for that child to really kind of rehab is going to be pretty good. Unfortunately, as we age, our neurons they're not quite as plastic. They don't quite, work as quickly as they used to. And so as a result, especially with Alzheimer's disease, which is so aggressive and destroys so many neurons, unfortunately, the brain doesn't have the opportunity to kind of, mend itself back together and work around those damaged areas. Or if a person has a stroke, if they're a younger person, believe it or not, they can begin to compensate for some of that damage, but the older a person is, the less likely that's going to be able to happen. So this slide number 44, tells the story of Jody, who is a young child who has had what's called a hemispherectomy. And I believe it is the right hemisphere of her cerebral cortex is actually removed, and it tells the story of what happened with her. So it's an underlined, where it says neuroplasticity is underlined. You click on that link and it'll take you out to the story of Jody. On the next slide, slide number 45. Slide number 45 is looking at our hormone system. Now, this is operating in the endocrine system. And you'll remember in the video that we watched last class, the chemical messengers that operate very quickly are going to be the neurotransmitters. The ones that operate much more slowly are the hormones. So these are the hormones that I want you to remember. One of them is melatonin, which has to do with our sleep-awake cycle. Okay. Another one is corticosteroids, which promote muscle growth. And by the way, melatonin chemically is very, very similar to serotonin. I apologize. Our lab is, our Great Dane is seeing something and she's getting upset. Epinephrine increases arousal level and gets us ready for action. Another word for epinephrine is also adrenaline. And then testosterone are the masculine hormones and estrogen, the feminine hormones. Now remember, folks, that these hormones are manufactured or developed in what are known as the gonads, which are the sexual reproductive organs of both males and females. And males and females have both testosterone and estrogen. It's just the levels differ depending on what gender you are. Okay? On to the next, the reticular activating system, slide number 46. In this system, this is a bundle of fibers that goes from the hindbrain through the midbrain and into the forebrain. So these fibers, this is basically what happens, and it's responsible for our levels of alertness. We are photosensitive beings. In other words, we react to sunlight. And as night is beginning to fall, what starts to happen is our melatonin levels begin to rise in our bodies. As those levels rise, so does serotonin in our brain. This begins to calm. Now remember, serotonin is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. This begins to calm down the activity in our brain. It begins to slow it down. The first area where it begins to slow down is in the cerebral cortex. Then as we move further in the midbrain. Now remember, the midbrain is responsible, cerebral cortex, higher order thinking. Midbrain is responsible for our reflexes for vision and hearing. And then finally into the hindbrain, which is responsible for heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, those kinds of things. So as the melatonin levels rise and serotonin levels rise, then it begins to close things down and prepare us for sleep. Toward the morning, as sun is beginning to break, okay, then just the opposite happens. That our respiration, everything begins to rise. Our heart rate, blood pressure. Then in the midbrain, we begin to respond to things that we hear from the outside, like the birds chirping. Pretty soon it's going to be spring. You know, I'm the optimist that way. And also being able to see things when we first wake up. And then finally, we come out of the fog and we realize where we're at and that sort of thing. So that's what's happening with the reticular activating system, sometimes referred to as reticular formation. The last thing that we're going to be talking about here is our ability to speak and understand speech. There are two primary areas in the brain that are responsible for speech and understanding speech. The first area is called Broca's area. Broca's area, and you can see it is very near the motor cortex, okay? It's on the left hemisphere of the brain. It's that small pink area there, and it's in the frontal lobe. Broca's area is responsible for our actual ability to speak. In other words, form words. The muscles in our mouth, in our throat, our larynx, those kinds of things, that's what's controlling that area. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, Wernicke's area lies in the temporal lobe near the auditory cortex, and this is our ability to understand speech. So we can understand what another person is saying, and we can take and identify objects, like this is a pen, and we can relay that information to somebody else. So it processes language and enables us to understand other people's language and plus what we're saying. So realistically, Broca's area and Wernicke's area work in concert with each other so that we can actually speak and so that we can understand what someone else is saying. But sometimes something goes wrong. And so if we look at slide number 49, it's called expressive aphasia. So if there's damage to Broca's area, what will happen is the person can understand speech, but they can't actually form the words. Physically, they have a great deal of difficulty. So it may come out being very slurred. It may be hard for another person to comprehend, that sort of thing. With Wernicke's aphasia, or Wernicke's expressive aphasia, what happens is the person can't understand words. They may look at this and say it's a watch. Okay, so they have difficulty identifying what things are, expressing what those things are, and then actually communicating with another person. So the sounds that they make are crisp and clear, but sometimes it sounds like gibberish and doesn't make any sense. Okay, so there you have it, folks. Like I said, there are active links within the PowerPoint itself. So download the PowerPoint to your computer, pull it up in Microsoft PowerPoint, put it on the full screen, and then you can actually click on those links and it will take you out to different videos that will help you with this. And plus, the other nice thing about me lecturing this way is if you miss something or you think that I've gone too fast, you can simply rewind me. Okay, I hope you have a safe day, enjoy the snow, and I will see you all on Monday. Take care.